A world powered by the blockchain is being formed right in front of our eyes. Experts are calling it the Internet 3.0, the next digital revolution. It's leaving many investors and even institutions looking for a path to take an early position in this massive opportunity. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ripple, Dash, it's all speculation at this point. But what is certain is that the most profitable businesses for cryptocurrency and the blockchain is in the actual creation of these coins. This is why some of the top early adopters of Bitcoin, blockchain miners, fund managers, and even billionaires have come together to create a new vehicle to invest in the blockchain core itself. Get immediate access to this new company by going to crushthestreet.com/Bitcoin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into crushthestreet.com. We got an exciting interview for everyone today. David Birch is on the line with me today, and he's a first-time guest. He's a well-renowned thought leader in the cryptocurrency community. He has written the book Before Babylon, Beyond Bitcoin, and was featured in the documentary The Blockchain and Us. And this is one of those things that is just going absolutely viral, and we are seeing cryptocurrency take the world by storm here, and it's very exciting. So without any further ado, David Birch, thanks for coming on crushthestreet.com.
Oh, flattered to be invited. It's really nice to be here.
Well, by way of introduction, please tell us how you got introduced to cryptocurrency and specifically Bitcoin.
Well, actually, I don't want to sound too old, otherwise people will think I'm out of touch with all of this crazy new technology. But I worked on the first generation of electronic cash replacement technologies, which is 20 odd years ago now. So people won't remember this, but in the 90s there was this first technological wave. And that involved things like chip cards, which were new then, and things like Mondex and Visa Cash and Danmont, SEMP, Semepa, ChipNip, all these kind of things. But it also involved DigiCash, which was one of the very first attempts to make a digital cash replacement. In other words, cash that could be exchanged peer-to-peer on the network. So my interest in it goes back an awfully long way. And one of the reasons I got so interested in it was because when I was required to look at some of the business possibilities around electronic cash, I began to think that we were being a bit limited in our thinking because we were thinking only of making kind of digital versions of the cash that we already had rather than new kinds of cash. And this is where my interest stems from. And so over the years, first of all, remember, the consulting company that I helped to found, Consult Hyperion, I think has a very good reputation. But our clients were not, fintech startups overthrowing the established order. Our clients were Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover, the big banks, and so on. So my perspective on it was, I guess, sort of more institutional. So you fast forward and you get to along comes Bitcoin. And because I'm interested in these kind of things, I was interested in that. Again, from a client's point of view, how could our clients take advantage of that? And I took myself off to the first European Bitcoin conference, which was in Prague. And I remember at that conference thinking, this stuff is pretty interesting, but I'm not convinced about the currency aspect. And I found myself at the conference getting more and more interested in the blockchain and consensus protocols and the ability to start thinking about a world of smart contracts, much more than I was interested in Bitcoin as a currency. And I guess part of the reason why I'm seen as being something of a heretic in the core community is because I essentially still have that skepticism about the currency aspects. So the first point to make is, in my head, there's a big distinction between cryptocurrency and shared ledgers. And very, very interested in the use of shared ledgers to rebuild financial marketplaces in new and better ways. So that's the first point to make. The second point...
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, the second point to make, I think, is like, what kind of marketplaces could we rebuild? And there, I'm very interested in the world of token. And I'll get to the point about land registries and so on in a minute. But I just want to open up on why I think it rather than what I think.
I'm totally interested in talking about those things and really the direction of blockchain. I know we were kind of talking about that in the pre-interview here. So before we do, I thought it was really interesting that you brought up the 90s and the early stages of internet money, internet cash, digicash. And I actually just watched this clip on Milton Friedman speaking about the natural free markets and the nature of people and governments. And this was back in the 90s. And he basically describes Bitcoin in an interview that you people can Google or watch. Maybe we'll include it in this interview here. And he basically says that the major effect of the internet will make it harder for governments to collect taxes. And as with a house, it's very easy because a house doesn't move. People have to live there. It's very easy for the government to tax that. But when it comes to other things that happen on cyberspace, that is so much uncontrollable. It can kind of go anywhere. It's like trying to hold water in your hand. It just, as soon as you close it, it goes out. But the one thing that was missing at the time in the 90s was a reliable internet e-cash. And it looks like Bitcoin has solved that problem. And I'm not sure if you agree with that or not, but it's just very fascinating to see where technology is taking everything.
I think the reason why I'm slightly skeptical about Bitcoin in that context is, well, as you just illustrated, talking about the 90s, I think some people think that Bitcoin is an idea that just arrived from another planet. But of course it's not. It's part of an evolutionary tree of cryptography and value transfer and electronic money and that kind of thing. And, Bitcoin came out of some precursors. I mean, there were things like DigiCash and Hashcash and so on before that, and it was put together in a really clever way. But the idea that Bitcoin is the end of that evolutionary tree strikes me as being rather odd. And I certainly think it's more like something like the steam engine, really, where someone has invented this amazing new way of doing things, which happens to be hopelessly inefficient, but it does one thing really well. In the case of the steam engine, that was pumping water out of mines. In the case of Bitcoin, it's censorship-resistant value transfer. But somebody else is going to come along and invent better and more efficient versions. And Bitcoin falls, I think, a little bit. I mean, I'm sure some of the people more at the heart of the community would disagree with me, but in a way, it's sort of not anonymous enough to fulfill the role of the black economy. It's not anonymous enough for money laundering and drug dealing and so on, which is why it's not used for it terribly much. But other people will come along with things like Zcash and those derivatives.
Okay.
On the other hand, it's not efficient enough to be used as a mass market payments infrastructure. So you either have to use it as a security infrastructure and build another layer on top, like Lightning networks or something like that. So you see what I mean? Like, as it stands, it kind of falls in the middle a little bit, which is why I'm skeptical about it long term. But if you see it as part of an evolutionary tree of technologies, you can see that there are some more branches yet to come, which will provide a form of natural selection, to fill those other niches. But the point is, if you go back to what was being said, I mean, I wasn't the only person back in the 90s that thought this by any means, which is that we see the new technologies as a way of making the payment system better. We see them as changing the payment system, but we probably weren't taking seriously enough their ability to change money itself. And I think it took the arrival of Bitcoin. By the way, I think that also has something to do with the timing with relation to the crash as well. I mean, had Bitcoin come along a few years before the crash, it might not have seized the imagination in the same way.
Oh, absolutely.
But we had the crash, and then we had Bitcoin, and that served, whether you think Bitcoin will succeed in the long run or not, it served a fantastically useful role of getting people to think about money again in different ways. And actually, and I hope my book contributes to that discussion in some way, whether you agree with me or not. I hope you feel that I've contributed something to the discussion.
Sure. Well, David, I'm very interested. I love speaking to different people. A lot of times, I speak to people on this show who maybe a little more pro the monetary components of Bitcoin. And I'm not saying you're against it, but you're sounding like you have some skepticism towards it, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And I welcome a diversity of opinion here on Crush the Street. So I guess I'm interested in what your thoughts are in terms of the developments that have been happening in Bitcoin. We had the August 1st hard fork. Many have seen that as opportunity to advance Bitcoin, people pro Bitcoin Cash. And then also we have a potential or a hard fork here in November, SegWit 2X. So in terms of moving along, what are your thoughts?
Well, remember, from my perspective, because I'm less interested in Bitcoin as a form of money, and in fact, I mean, as far as I can tell, almost all of the Bitcoin trading that goes on at the moment is a combination of speculation and market manipulation. So it's impossible to tell anything about the long-term trajectory of Bitcoin as a money from what's going on at the moment. But its ability to construct a trustless infrastructure, a kind of global security computer, is radical and new. And then you ask yourself, well, what kind of things could that global security computer do if it's not going to be a currency? And I think this is what takes us into the world of things like tokens and ICOs, because then you can see that if the cryptocurrency itself is not necessarily the heart of the future economic system, it might be the secure underpinning of things that are. And that's an argument I find a little more convincing, because they don't depend on Bitcoin itself, because other things that are like Bitcoin could also provide that underpinning. And I also think there's a kind of an intellectual scaffolding around the token and ICO space, which I can see and understand, and I'm frankly sympathetic to.
Okay.
Which makes logical sense to me. So one of the things I mention in my book is the work of so a lot of people on, I think, what you would probably label the Austrian side of things, talk about Hayek's conception of private currency, which was actually competing bank private currencies, and from there begin to talk about the potential for completely private currencies. And because I tend to think that the future world is a world of lots of different currencies, I mean, I think I made it clear from the introduction to the book, I don't believe the Star Trek, we're going to have a galactic credit kind of future, whether it's US dollars or Bitcoins or anything else. The future is about lots of different currencies, not one. I mean, we can already tell that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking to you from Europe, where we can already see that a single currency doesn't really work for Germany and for Greece, because their economic conditions are so different. So, why would it work for the whole world? That's not money should be our servant, not our master.
One of my previous guests, Rick Roll, very smart man, he said, he's not deep into cryptocurrencies, but one of the things he pointed out that I thought was fascinating is that he likes competition of money. And cryptocurrency is competition for fiat money, any type of money out there. So if there's more competition out there, it puts pressure on everyone else to be that much better. So any thoughts on that?
I agree with that. And Hayek's idea of having monies that would compete to keep their value up rather than to inflate their value away, I'm intellectually very attracted to. So I would agree with that. But I think if you stir that in the pot of new technology and networks and security and cryptography, what you end up with is a world with thousands, potentially millions of different currencies. And I find that a more compelling and practical vision of the future than trying to have some sort of galactic credit has the same value here and on Alpha Centauri. So if there are going to be lots of different kinds of money, which I think there will be, what kinds of private money might there be? Now, Edward de Bono, the chap who was famous for lateral thinking, you're probably too young for this, but when I started work, you quite often got sent on management training courses where you had to wear different colour hats at some point in the events, and that was one of de Bono's ideas as well. But he published a little pamphlet called the IBM Dollar in the early 1990s, which I thought was an amazing piece of work at the time. Now remember, this is before the internet and Bitcoin and everything else. And what de Bono said was, if companies issued their own money, so if IBM issued IBM dollars, which would be used for the purchase of IBM goods and services in the future, you would have a more efficient, more liquid market, because companies having their own money is basically better than equities and debt, because you'd have millions of these currencies and they'd constantly trade against each other in an efficient foreign exchange market and would always have the right value. And so, if I decide to start a company, Dave Co., I issue my own money, which is Dave money. And to begin with, Dave money might trade at a pretty substantial discount to Kenneth money. But perhaps over time, if my services become useful and the market wants them, then the value of Dave money would go up. So instead of having conventional equities and debt, you just have different kinds of money. And that sounded kind of wacky back then. But when you start to think about the decentralizing nature of technology and where it's taking us, it's not so crazy. And it's amazing to me that de Bono wrote, again, this is 25 years ago, he said, well, of course, when you go into a shop to buy something, what's really going on is your computer is talking to the shop's computer. And between each other, computers could sort out millions of currencies. Why would you care? My computer might know. I mean, let's imagine, at the other end of my smartphone is my AI supercomputer giant killer robot that's looking after my pension plan. And my pension plan might be that I need so much water, I need so much electricity, I need some food, I need this kind of stuff. Why use money that has an uncertain value as the intermediary when you can just trade those things themselves? And so when I go into the store to buy something, my computer and the store's computer would have a discussion about which basket of currencies the store wants from me, what kind of things I would accept, what kind of things we have to trade away in the market. And that would take place in nanoseconds.
Wow.
25 years ago, that was like reading something out of Neuromancer. But now it has a surprising resonance to me with the world of tokens and ICOs. And the idea that instead of having conventional equity, conventional debt, you want to create a new business, you create your own money. So you see what I mean about the intellectual scaffolding being appealing to me. I can see a logic to a regulated token ICO market, which I see in the context of private monies, rather than perhaps more conventional equity and debt markets. Does that make sense, Ken?
Yeah, no, I'm wrapping my mind around it, and I guess that's really incentivizing for the creators of the funds, the money, the businesses behind the money. But I guess for the person who needs to hold the money, that puts a little more effort and stress on that person to do a little bit of research to figure out which one is going to be the safe
you say
current
person. You see, and that's where I think our visions might differ slightly, because I don't imagine me as a person doing this. I imagine my AI doing this. And so I think what would be a more likely vision of the future is that I choose somebody or some group whose policies I agree with. Let's just say, for sake of argument, it's the NRA. Okay, so I agree with the NRA. So I go to the NRA website and I download the NRA money policy, and my AI executes that for me. So when I go into a store and I go to buy something, which basket of currencies I'm prepared to sell or trade away is determined by that policy. It would be crazy to imagine people would look at these things individually. That doesn't make sense. That's not the future we're looking at.
Right.
So I don't think me as an individual, I don't think I'd be involved in those transactions very much. I walk into the store, I say, how much is that cola? And my phone tells me it's 1 London pound, because London pounds is the currency that I'm comfortable with. I think in London pounds. I want the prices shown to be in London pounds. And when I hit the pay button, of course, the actual currencies that go into that transaction there could be 10 of them, 1 million of them, 1 of them, who knows? But I don't want to be involved in that. That's the sort of boring stuff that computers can do. So I'm interested in setting the overall policy. For most people, they won't be able to set those overall policies. I mean, frankly, Kenneth, I consider myself an intelligent person, right? I have a science degree. I know what a blockchain is. I mean, if that's the new bar for intelligence, I've managed to jump over that. But in terms of choosing the policy for my pension allocations, I am nowhere. I want to choose somebody who specializes in that to do that for me, and I want to download their policy and I want to execute that. So it sounds crazy that you would have these millions of currencies, but that's if you think about people doing it. But that's not the world that we're moving into, really, is it?
Sure. Well, and it makes sense because what you're describing is in many ways how people buy stocks. The average person buys a basket of stocks, and there's a level of safety to different degrees when you buy the Dow Jones versus just some random stock if you want to just put everything on autopilot. So that does make a bit of sense.
Evidence, I mean, I'm not an expert on these things, but as I understand it, I mean, I keep seeing these things in Twitter from Warren Buffett and people like that, and people who are rich, and I'm not. And they seem to say that, basically investing in these baskets of stocks beats trying to roll the dice on any particular one, right?
It's very true. I think the average person out there is losing money in the market rather than actually beating the mindless baskets that are out there. So
that's how I understand it. As I say, I'm not an expert, but that's my understanding. So you could see a similar kind of thing would be with money, except that because you can do these peer-to-peer transfers, the money market, the new money market, would be more efficient than the existing equity and debt markets, and that would be the attraction of going down that route.
Sure. Okay, David, so let's talk a little bit here. We got about 5 more minutes, and I want to talk about the future of blockchain and how it's implemented, for instance, in home ownership. Right now we have a home ownership, and that is something that in the U.S. is controlled by the government, and the database is centralized. And I'm just curious, the implementation of this, how do we segue over to something that has a long history and then putting that into the blockchain? How does the blockchain take over?
Well, look, I think the rather naive view that you could move to a system where property is just an asset on the blockchain and a blockchain transfer means an asset transfer, frankly, I don't buy that. So, if you're 20 years old and you're an MIT computer science undergraduate, the idea of kind of self-sovereignty, caveat emptor, it's the Wild West, that all sounds great when you're a kid, okay? But the first time that your grandma presses on the wrong button in an email, and now all of a sudden her life savings belong to somebody in Vladivostok and you can't get them back, it doesn't sound like such a great idea. So the idea that we're going to operate without institutions, I think, is wrong. I think we are people who want to live in a society. I mean, if we didn't, we'd just go and live in Somalia or somewhere, right? We want to live in a society with order. What we want is more efficiency. And that means there are certain attributes of shared ledger implementations, robustness, transparency, the space for real innovation in my mind comes at the kind of smart contract layer, the ability to execute new kinds of software on this new kind of computer that we're building. Seems to me to have some unlimited possibilities. So I don't buy the kind of the simplistic, well, we're just going to put our houses on the blockchain. I think what we're looking at is a different kind of market that still has institutions, but institutions that work in a slightly different way, but executes in a more efficient manner, and provides a platform for innovation and for some new possibilities. So I'm excited and enthusiastic about it, but probably not in the sort of simple way I often see reported on the web, which just cannot be right. I mean, this idea that you're going to move the land registry over to the blockchain and just execute transactions on that blockchain, that seems implausible to me.
Extremely fascinating what's happening. So I guess it's a transition over time that will lend itself to blockchain technology.
One way to think about it is there's a superb book by Edward Balesin, the professor. He wrote a book recently called it's gone out of my mind. It's called The History of American Fraud. Well, I call it The History of American Fraud. I'm not sure if that's what the actual book's called. I'll just quickly look it up for you. Oh yeah, Fraud in American History from Barnum to Madoff. And it has a wonderfully rich telling of the evolution from the Wild West, which is, because that's very much part of the American sensibility. You lived in the Wild West, and it was caveat emptor and so on. And the steady march away from that to institutions and regulation and food safety standards and all this kind of stuff is a fabulous story. And I think the right way to see the evolution of blockchain technology is as a better way of doing some of those things. I don't think it's a way of sweeping away those things. I think it's a better way of doing some of them.
Well, David Birch, everyone. David, I want to thank you for coming on Crush the Street and just sharing your thoughts. It's really incredible to see what is going on in cryptocurrencies. And I don't think anyone has come on and talked about the basket of currencies and artificial intelligence telling us, which ones are the best ones to be in and how we will be paying for products in the future. And I know you're not saying that's exactly where things are going, but you opened our minds to the potential of where things are headed. And I think it's really exciting. And I would love to actually speak to you about this hopefully in the near future again, and especially as things are advancing, and maybe we'll have 1,500, 2,000 different cryptocurrencies, and things might actually be trending towards that direction. But if people want to learn more about you, just please share some closing thoughts here and where they can find your work.
Sure. Well, my website is www.dgwbirch.com, and I'm at dgwbirch on Twitter. And I write for my own blog, which is there, and I also write on Medium. And I hope you don't think I'm crazy. I hope you think
Certainly
I'm
not.
Trying to look at the future in an intelligent way.
Yeah, certainly not. I don't think you're crazy at all. People have differing opinions. I tend to see Bitcoin as developing and being very, very resilient. And I think there's going to be a lot of strength in Bitcoin going forward because of the first mover advantage and, this history, its network effect, all these different things that I believe people are going to hold on to, and Bitcoin will remain strong. But I don't discount the fact that competition will come online and things can change. So having said that, David, thanks so much for coming on Crush the Street today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.